Welcome. Welcome to this unique conference jointly organized by the Classical Liberal Institute of New York University and the Schumpeter Project on Competition Policy of the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. The idea of this conference came up with shared concerns about the weakening of the rule of law in antitrust enforcement. Also, we wanted to discuss the large unintended consequence on innovation of the different regulatory proposals on antitrust and competition. It seems that we are at a crossroad. Will antitrust enforcement fade away in order to become another set of regulations on competition? In other words, does this shift from ex post antitrust enforcement to more ex ante rules of competition signal an unstoppable rise of regulation over litigation in antitrust? And if so, what are the consequences in terms of the importance for the rule of law, for consumer benefits, and the pace of disruptive innovation of such shift? So my name is Aurélien Portuez, and I'm the director of the Schumpeter Project on Competition Policy at ITIF. And I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference, FTC Commissioner Christine Wilson. Honorable Christine Wilson was sworn in on September 26, 2018 as Commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. President Trump named Commissioner Wilson to a term that expires on September 25, 2025. Wilson previously served as at the FTC as Chairman's Tim Morris Chief of Staff during the Bush administration, and also as a law clerk in the Bureau of Competition while attending Georgetown University Law Center. In between a period of service at the FTC, Commissioner Wilson has practiced competition and consumer protection law, both at law firms and as in-house counsel. When nominated, Commissioner Wilson was serving as Senior Vice President, Legal, Regulatory, and International for Delta Airlines. And prior to joining Delta, Commissioner Wilson was a member of the Washington, D.C. Antitrust Practice Group of Kirkland and Ellis and O'Melveny Myers. Commissioner Wilson has graduated from Georgetown University Law Center and from the University of Florida. Commissioner Wilson has been a force for good in antitrust for years, constantly advocating for greater adherence to the consumer welfare standards and constantly raising alarms about the unintended consequences of regulations when it comes to competition. The current neo-Brandeisian revolution has for sure provided Commissioner Wilson with an even greater opportunity to articulate at length in her dissents, often with Commissioner Noah Phillips, a view about antitrust. If I can recap briefly, this view is a view where the legal predictability of the rule of law becomes embodied in the consumer welfare standard, which is designed to avoid consumer harm and innovation cost. So without further ado, Commissioner Wilson, the floor, or perhaps the screen is yours. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. It is good to be here, and it is great to see so many old friends and colleagues. And so I am very pleased to join you today. Like many of you, I have studied and worked in the field of antitrust law and policy for decades. Over the years, the field has evolved. Enforcers have incorporated new economic learning into their analytical frameworks. Courts developed new legal precedent, and both law and economics have been applied to dynamic and evolving markets. The field isn't static, and it isn't meant to be, as the Supreme Court noted in Kimball v. Marvel. For most of my career, a bipartisan consensus has existed regarding the appropriate analytical framework for antitrust enforcement. Yes, serious antitrust thinkers disagree about whether to emphasize type 1 versus type 2 errors. As a law student, I took Professor Salop's classes at Georgetown, and I worked as his research assistant. He's a key proponent of more aggressive enforcement, but make no mistake, Steve would continue to ground antitrust enforcement in economic principles. But then something changed. We saw the clues, calls to replace the consumer welfare standard, the Better Deal document from Senate Democrats, Tim Wu's book, The Curse of Bigness, which asserted that because large enterprises are inherently bad, they should be prevented from forming. Commissioner Chopra's criticisms of the FTC as lax and feckless, calls for railroad-type regulation for big tech despite the past regulatory failures and fiascos. The House Judiciary Committee's proposals that extended far beyond big tech, like reinvigoration of the essential facilities doctrine, removing the recoupment prong for predatory pricing, and so on. Chair Khan's destruction of collegiality and procedural norms after she arrived at the FTC, including the famous zombie votes. And throughout this period, defenders of the status quo were labeled more than just wrong, they were evil and corrupt. I hear that Barry Lynn and Zephyr Teachout shared this view yesterday at the chair's showcase. They accused the antitrust bar of destroying democracy. I've been mystified by these developments, and so I started looking for explanations, and I realized this isn't about one individual's idiosyncrasies or another individual's toxic Twitter behavior. There is a broader pattern, and I believe a unifying worldview. In undergrad, I took a class called Great Political Thinkers. The professor told us we were fortunate to be his students because there were 100 ways to interpret Machiavelli, but he was going to teach us the one right way. Now, I can't assure you that I'm going to describe the one right way to interpret all of the developments that we're seeing in the field of antitrust. I am still reading tomes of history and philosophy and trying to make sense of where we are. But today, I will share the results of my research so far. I will tell you what I've read and what I've seen, and I will share with you my working hypothesis. A united worldview is driving these developments, and that worldview draws heavily on concepts from Marxism and critical legal studies. Today, I'm going to look at a variety of concepts through the lens of Western liberal thought, then Marxism and critical legal studies, or CLS, and then through the lens of the neo-Brandeisians. I think you'll agree with me, there are fascinating parallels in these worldviews. And if you think that the anti-monopoly movement is focused only on reining in the biggest companies, hopefully these parallels will disabuse you of that notion. They seek total control of the economy. I'll conclude with a couple of thoughts on the focus of today's conference, innovation. Spoiler alert, none of the parallels that I'll be discussing bode well for an innovation-friendly environment. And finally, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Truth on the Market blog posts of Lazar Radic, who has made some really valuable observations on Marxism and competition. So, Aurelian mentioned the rule of law. It's a great place to begin. As you know, liberalism is the foundation of our country. Liberalism entails government with the consent of the governed, democracy, equality, guaranteed liberties, and separated institutions checking and balancing one another. These principles are enshrined in our Constitution and enforced by reasonably independent judges under the rule of law, largely insulated from partisan politics. UScourts.gov defines the rule of law as a principle under which all persons, institutions, and entities are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, and consistent with international human rights principles. And Hayek says the rule of law means the government is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand, rules which make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive power in given circumstances. The rule of law is above politics, culture, and the value and preferences of any person, which allows the law to be objective and principled and fair. But Marxists take a very different view. Marx characterized society in terms of its base and superstructure, akin to the foundation and the building that rests on it. For Marx, the base pertained to the prevalent economic mode of production in a society. The superstructure was comprised of the non-economic aspects of society, including law, politics, media, family, culture, philosophy, and so on. The superstructure reinforces the base, i.e., the existing means of production. So Marx believed that the law is clearly an instrument of the ruling class. It both defines and defends these rulers' claims upon resources and labor power, and it mediates class relations with a set of appropriate rules, all of which confirm and consolidate existing class power. Hence, according to Marx, the rule of law is only another mask for the rule of a class. Marx also asserted, more specifically, the rule of law is a bourgeois notion that merely reproduces the inequality of unequal labor. There are interesting parallels between what Marx taught and what critical legal studies scholars believe. Now, not all CLS scholars are Marxists, but CLS builds on many concepts that are expressed by Marx. Georgetown Law, where I went, had many known CLS scholars as professors, including Mark Tushnet. He wrote that from a critical legal studies perspective, the rule of law is an ideological project that serves as an instrument of oppression by the group that happens to be in power. CLS scholars, in other words, challenge the concept of a value-neutral legal process. Instead, they argue the system is built by elites who have a stake in rationalizing their dominant power positions, so they define rights in a way that reinforces existing hierarchies of wealth and privilege. Or, in other words, law is politics, and politics is power. That's also taught at Yale, where Chair Khan went. Neo-Brandesians view the law, and specifically the field of antitrust law, in the same way that Marx and CLS scholars view the rule of law. Specifically, the Neo-Brandesians reject the belief that antitrust law is above or outside of politics. In fact, according to Neo-Brandesians, markets themselves are political. Sandeep Vaheesan of Open Markets Institute, a former colleague and co-author with Chair Khan, has written that because the state constructs and structures markets through legal rules, the market is not a force of nature, as the law and economics ideology underpinning antitrust presumes. Instead, he writes, the idea of markets is a useful construct for defenders of the status quo because it lends legitimacy to the current order. And Chair Khan agrees that markets are political. During an interview with Stuart Varney, she said that all decisions are political insofar as government agencies are bringing them. Now, if you've served at the FTC or DOJ, as many of you have, you may say, wait a minute, the agencies and courts make decisions based on sound economic and legal precedent. But Matt Stoller of the American Economic Liberties Institute, a former colleague and staunch ally of Chair Khan, argues that the point of economics as a discipline is to create a language and methodology for governing that hides political assumptions from the public. So the Neo-Brandesians reject the characterization of antitrust law as value neutral and relatively free from political interference. If antitrust isn't value neutral, then neither is the consumer welfare standard. Vaheesan wrote that the antitrust law is and will be political. He also wrote that an antitrust enforcer anchored in consumer welfare is an antitrust enforcer anchored in anti-labor. Western liberalism prizes the rule of law for creating predictability and certainty regarding the rules of the road. But the Neo-Brandesians at the FTC have fostered uncertainty, not certainty, withdrawing policy statements and guidelines and leaving policy vacuums, telling us the vertical merger guidelines aren't strict enough, but not telling us where the new lines will be drawn, failing to challenge mergers within requisite statutory timeframes, but issuing threatening warning letters as waiting periods expire so that merging parties will need to continually look in the rearview mirror, which also undermines incentives to invest. So where does this leave us? Let's recap. The Neo-Brandesians, like Marx and CLS scholars, believe that antitrust enforcement is a politicized exercise that serves to reinforce existing inequities. This perspective appears to explain several aspects of the Neo-Brandesian worldview. If antitrust is indeed a tool of oppression, it makes sense that the Neo-Brandesians paint those who helped shape the status quo or who now defend it as not just wrong, but evil and corrupt. It doesn't matter if you are a Democrat or a Republican. The Neo-Brandesians view enforcers of both parties from the last 40 years as corrupt. In the same way that large companies are evil and small companies are good, the Neo-Brandesians view people as evil or good. You're either a pro-monopolist or an anti-monopolist, period. One form of attack focuses on the revolving door. On the day he was sworn in, then Commissioner Chopra published a monograph that took a far-reaching view of conflicts of interest. Specifically, he said, even in the absence of direct financial interests, the enforcement decisions of government employees could be influenced by the possibility of future employment in the private sector. And Chair Khan has written that the Department of Justice enforcer who aspires eventually to join JP Morgan may hesitate to antagonize a potential employer. Many of you in attendance today have served in government. I ask you to reflect on whether you pulled your enforcement punches to curry favor with folks in the private sector. In his new capacity as CFPB director, Chopra reiterated this view just a couple of weeks ago, explaining that financial regulators are clueless and often corrupt lawyers and economists who are merely auditioning for future jobs in the private sector. As Barry Lynn and Zephyr Teachout indicated at the ABA Antitrust Section Spring Meeting in the Chair's Showcase, the ABA is viewed as part of the establishment, the so-called ruling class that helps shape antitrust law and policy. It too is therefore complicit in this oppression. And that might explain why Commissioner Chopra and Chair Khan worked hard to keep the ABA antitrust section at arm's length. Remember, Barry Lynn is Chair Khan's former boss, and Chair Khan has served as Professor Teachout's co-author. She also worked on Teachout's campaign for governor of New York when Tim Wu was campaigning for lieutenant governor. And of course, this view condemns the FTC and its staff as complicit in the oppression. And that might explain why former Commissioner Chopra has such a dim view of not just the FTC, which he consistently called lax and feckless, but of FTC staff. Then Commissioner Chopra did not trust FTC staff. He believed that they were captured by the industries they oversaw. Indeed, Commissioner Chopra asked the FTC's Inspector General to review the work of staff with respect to pharmaceutical mergers. And Chopra told Congress that staff attendance at conferences and participation in panels should be viewed with suspicion. Could this have been the driving force behind the decision to muzzle staff when Chair Khan arrived? Instead of promoting transparency and certainty regarding government enforcement intentions and facilitating legal compliance, Chair Khan prohibited staff from attending and participating in conferences. And perhaps this also explains why Chair Khan has been so reluctant to seek the input of staff on policy issues. For her, staff are part of the corrupt establishment. I explained in my speech at the ABA Fall Forum the many ways in which staff have been marginalized under new leadership. It is a tragedy, and it is causing many good people to leave the agency. Of course, antitrust actually has been a force for good in recent history, and powerful companies have been reined in. But CLS scholars would explain these successes as a smokescreen. They believe that because the law must be perceived to be approximately just, the ruling class cannot win all the time. And for that reason, the neo-Brandesians ignore the fact that the FTC has been an amazing force for good for American consumers. The neo-Brandesians also share the Marxist and CLS distrust of due process. As I noted at the outset, classical liberalism is premised on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. To protect these rights, liberalism is grounded in process. One scholar notes, what has distinguished the American Constitution and indeed the United States itself has been a process of government, not a governing ideology. Critical legal studies, on the other hand, views due process as preventing benevolent change. Procedural rules are merely speed bumps on the road to justice. Because procedural rules reflect political choices, they can be tossed aside to achieve desired substantive change. In their desire to remake antitrust law, the neo-Brandesians have embraced a similar disregard for process and norms. They know what the utopian antitrust regime looks like, and they are willing to toss aside all procedural niceties to get there. One example. In the midst of abrupt and sweeping policy changes at the FTC, without public input, with little to no input from staff, and with essentially no notice to minority commissioners, I raised process concerns. In response, a staffer at the American Economic Liberties Project, remember where Matt Stoller works, whose Twitter handle was @PharmaCheats, tweeted that, quote, voters barely care about the process of themselves voting in elections. The idea that anyone gives a shit about internal FTC process is laughable. No one cares, thanks, close quote. Note, PharmaCheats was the Twitter handle for David Barclay, who now serves as an attorney advisor in Chair Khan's office at the FTC. I'd like to read some quotes about classical liberalism and then discuss how the actions of the neo-Brandesians measure up. Here's a quote. Because of the value liberals place on liberty, they tend to be wary of the power concentrations that could mandate changes quickly. But Chair Khan has consolidated power in the office of the chair since arriving at the commission. She's made changes to the rules of practice regarding the rulemaking process that place far more power in the chair's office. She's passed omnibus resolutions that ensure one commissioner's vote is sufficient to authorize staff to use compulsory process in almost all of our investigations. and she is seeking to remodel the commission structure, eliminating any governing role for the other commissioners, including by denying us necessary information to oversee the operations of the agency. Here's another quote. Liberals prefer a more incremental approach to political change that depends on the consent of the governed. But Chair Khan has undertaken sweeping policy changes without typical opportunities for public input. She rescinded the 1995 prior approval policy statement without notice and comment, even though it was issued with notice and comment. The same for the vertical merger guidelines. In the first few open commission meetings, public input was accepted after votes occurred. How can the governed consent if their input is never sought? Third quote, liberalism is never utopian by anyone's definition, but always procedural, because it presupposes a society of people who profoundly disagree with each other and whose interests, goals, stakes, and stands cannot easily, if ever, be fully reconciled. Under Chairman Simons, Acting Chair Slaughter, and countless other FTC chairs, the Commission certainly experienced policy disagreements, but the careful observation of traditions and norms enabled commissioners to discuss their views with each other and with expert staff. Sometimes this process even resulted in the switching of votes from yes to no or no to yes under Chair Simons. But Chair Khan has assumed that Commissioner Phillips and I would vote no to justify ditching procedural niceties. A thorough process generates results that withstand the test of time. A dearth of process produces poor results. For example, the majority's statement on rescission of the vertical merger guidelines contains flawed assertions about economic principles in the view of leading commentators, Carl Shapiro and Herb Hovenkamp. Perhaps if the majority had circulated their draft statement to us, as is the norm, our draft dissent would have noted their errors and they could have fixed them. Or, as those leading commentators noted, even seeking the input of learned staff could have prevented the embarrassment of issuing a blatantly flawed statement. Final quote. Because of these differences, liberals know there is no such thing as a benevolent despot, and that utopias almost invariably turn out to be dystopias. Chair Khan speaks frequently of protecting workers, but in attempting to establish a utopian antitrust regime, she has alienated her very own workers, FTC staff. Under Chair Khan, morale has plummeted, and we have seen an exodus of stellar lawyers and economists. Let me move on to a discussion of capitalism and free markets. Black's Law Dictionary defines capitalism as a system in which the market serves as the principal driver of the economy. Assets are privately owned, labor is purchased for wages, gains accrue to private owners, and prices allocate capital and labor between potential uses. While the US is a capitalist country, it's worth noting that we have a fair amount of government intervention in the marketplace. The 2022 Index of Economic Freedom ranks the US 25th out of 177 ranked countries. The study also finds that the standard of living is much higher in economically freer countries. But Marx viewed capitalism in an entirely different light. He taught that the oppressed proletariat will rise up against their oppressors, the capitalists. The labor theory of value is the key to this conclusion. It teaches the value of any commodity is measured in terms of the amount of labor embodied in it, the labor time required to produce it. The concept of surplus value is also important. Surplus value is the difference between the sale price of a product and the cost to produce it. Marx says owners of the means of production unfairly appropriate this surplus value from workers. In a market economy, the capitalists seek to gain an advantage over their rivals by driving down costs, increasing productivity, decreasing the price of goods and services. They reinvest the surplus that is wrongfully appropriated from labor into the expansion of productivity and acquisitions that increase scale. In other words, competition is the engine of capitalism, and the capitalists that can lower costs, appropriate the most surplus value from workers, and reinvest the most is both, in Marx's view, the most exploitative and the best positioned. The bottom line, according to Marx, is that capitalists steal from workers to obtain scale, lower costs, cheapen commodities, and beat their rivals in the market. Similarly, CLS scholars believe that efficiencies in a market economy are derived from legally granted entitlements, which of course go back to the illegitimacy of the superstructure in the first place. A look at the beliefs of the neo-Brandesians reveals many parallels. Chair Khan has sought to shift the focus from consumers to workers. She frequently references workers and honest businesses. Vihisen has stated, as I noted, an antitrust enforcer anchored in consumer welfare is an antitrust enforcer anchored in anti-labor. He embraced the concept that a once populist and progressive law against exploitation has become the law for exploiters. Efficiency and power win. On March 28th, Vihisen tweeted the FTC should treat lower prices derived from the exploitation of workers as an unfair method of competition. Tim Wu, now Special Assistant to the President for Technology and Competition Policy, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in July 2020 that also reflects this view. He demonized large flour producers for maximizing size and scale and driving down the price of flour through brute efficiency. He complained that this approach limited workers' salaries and reduced the prospects for small or local competitors. He celebrated the higher priced, smaller flour companies that employ more people relative to their size. Now, note the irony. Tim Wu was praising higher flour prices during the depths of the pandemic with unemployment levels at record highs. That seems to me very much a statement of the ruling class who seeks to oppress the underdog. In other words, the neo-Brandesians view the goals of the competitive process, increase productivity, lower costs, and lower prices, not as benefits, but as harms because they flow from the exploitation of workers. This approach may explain why efficiencies are viewed as a negative by the neo-Brandesians and why they push for a moratorium on mergers in 2020. Although mergers may increase productivity and lower prices, those outcomes to them signify worker exploitation. And this may also explain, as I've heard, I wasn't there, Holly Vedova, who's the head of the Bureau of Competition, couldn't identify this morning on her ABA panel a single positive thing about mergers. And I believe this also explains the rejection of the consumer welfare standard by the neo-Brandesians. I also think it helps us understand the aversion of neo-Brandesians to corporate growth and to mergers generally. Marx correlates the size of a company with its productivity and the magnitude of its worker exploitation. The neo-Brandesians also believe that big is bad, even aside from market power. This was the point of Tim Wu's book, The Curse of Bigness. And Chair Khan wrote an interesting article with Zephyr Teachout on this issue that I commend to you. Marx says that because of the competitive process, an ever-increasing number of ever more powerful capitalist overlords will emerge over the corpses and semi-corpses of small and middling capitalists. The neo-Brandesians also focused on the impact of mergers and conduct on smaller rivals. But this approach contravenes the established view that the antitrust laws protect competition, not competitors. Marx also said, thus, out of honest, democratic, progressive competition grows irrevocably harmful, parasitic, reactionary monopoly. Perhaps this worldview also explains why the neo-Brandesians continue to advance the narrative that concentration is increasing throughout our economy and their insistence on finding a monopolist under every bed. Let me discuss one important aspect of socialism, the emphasis on the group, the class, the collective over the individual. John Stuart Mill asserted that the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way. The free market is driven by the preferences of countless individuals. But in the social contract, Rousseau wrote, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains." He argued these chains include familiar institutions of society like family, church, and class, as well as rules, customs, and traditions. Hegel and Marx viewed the state as destroying these social ties, becoming the liberator, and releasing the individual from loyalty to anything but itself. By emphasizing loyalty to the state, socialism elevates the group or the collective above the individual. Chairman Mao said the individual is subordinate to the organization. On a related note, Marxists view as detrimental the creation and maintenance of individuals as economic and legal subjects, the bearers of property rights. Why? Because a right in bourgeois legal form fragments class solidarity and dampens the desire to collectively struggle against oppression. So the individual as the bearer of property rights is anathema to Marx. Like Marx, CLS scholars also reject a focus on individualism and property rights. Leading CLS scholar Roberto Unger said, traditional property rights protect social hierarchy at the expense of communal life. This approach views property rights as negative and toxic. A CLS scholar wrote that property rights in American culture have functioned as powerful symbols of individual freedom, of security, and productive efficiency, providing the incentives to labor, invest, and create. But this dominant ideology of property downplays or obscures property's other faces, which can be coercive and oppressive. Again, we see many neo-Brandesian parallels. The consumer welfare standard benefits individuals through lower prices, greater choice, higher quality, more innovation. But like Mao and the Marxists, the neo-Brandesians would have us subjugate the rights of the individual to the rights of favored groups. And Chair Khan has already told us that all decisions are political. So we know which groups are favored will depend on which way the political winds are blowing. A new bill that Senator Warren recently introduced previews some favored groups, including workers, sellers, small and minority-owned businesses, farms, ranches, local, rural, and low-income communities, and communities of color. We also see the influence of Marx and Mao in the neo-Brandesians' belief that corporations should not function for the benefit of their employees and shareholders, but instead for the benefit of society. Which leads us to socialism, in which the means of production will be controlled by the state. Planning will substitute for competition as the economy's steering mechanism. And the parallels with the neo-Brandesians, again, are striking. They exhibit a strong preference for heavy-handed regulation and competition rules. They view the massive regulatory frameworks that once governed railroads and airlines as successes. Indeed, Chair Khan has touted railroad regulations as a model for regulating big tech. They advocate for rules to govern competition generally, no more case-by-case ex-post enforcement, but instead an ex-ante ordering of the market. The list of rules they intend to create is breathtaking, and the government, rather than the private sector, should make the decisions. All of these concepts help us understand why the neo-Brandesians loathe the consumer welfare standard. While increased productivity and lower prices benefit consumers, those same things signify worker exploitation under the labor theory of value. Efficiencies, productivity, declining costs, and lower prices all point to, number one, the cheapening of commodities that Marx discussed. See also the Tim Wu New York Times op-ed on flour. And number two, the continued fragmentation of workers as a class, which prevents them from rising up against the oppressors. And third, the consumers must give up lower prices for the greater good. However, the politicized process is defining the greater good at that moment. In any event, an individual's rights, his income, and his standard of living are creations of an illegitimate superstructure. So let's talk a moment about destruction and revolution. Marx draws on the concepts of Rousseau, who sought to dissolve the civilized state responsible for what he saw as the moral degeneration and alienation of people from mainstream society. By destroying the existing society, people could build a new ideal society from scratch. Rousseau is widely believed to be an important muse for the Jacobins in the French Revolution. Rousseau said that in the life of the state, there are periods of violence when revolutions do to peoples what certain crises do to individuals, and when the state aflame with civil wars is reborn from its ashes and recovers the vigor of its youth. Of course, this is what the neo-Brandesians say. The FTC needs to be returned to the glory of its youth. Hegel also influenced Marx. He believed individuals and societies and states pass through a series of stages during the course of history, each one better than the next, in an endless progression toward perfection. For Hegel, war and destruction was indispensable in building political progress. Out of the crisis of war and tumult, a better version of the state was certain to emerge victorious. And of course, Marx believed that the inevitable result of capitalism was socialism and then the utopia of communism. One author noted that because revolutionaries are confident that the next stage of history will automatically represent progress, that any change will be for the better, they readily tear down and destroy the existing order, which historically has meant killing off anyone who resists, from rulers to peasants. And perhaps this is why the destruction of the FTC doesn't trouble the neo-Brandesians. And make no mistake, they are hell-bent on destroying the FTC. Then Commissioner Chopra routinely called the FTC lax and feckless. His characterizations assisted in undermining the bipartisan congressional support the FTC has long enjoyed. If you care about an institution, you suggest ways to make it better without trashing its past. Chair Khan has said that overreach is not on her top 10 list of concerns, but when the agency has engaged in overreach in the past, it has run into serious trouble with Congress and its appropriators. In light of this history, why would you willingly engage in overreach and court disaster for the agency? Current leadership has diminished and marginalized staff in astonishing ways, leading to a significant brain drain. Countless experienced FTCers with encyclopedic knowledge of their fields and fantastic management skills have fled. And this trend is both tragic and ironic. Many of these employees agree with Chair Khan's desire to engage in more aggressive enforcement, but without these skilled and dedicated employees, Chair Khan is going to have a hard time effectively implementing her agenda. And what on earth does all of this have to do with innovation, which is the topic for today? Marx assumes no private property, only state-controlled mechanisms of production. We know command and control economies lead to the drastic misallocation of resources. Consumers, citizens fare so badly in this kind of system. Take a look at the statistics about the availability and the quality of consumer goods in the Soviet Union as just one example. Marx talked about the dynamism of state and its ability to foster innovation. But our experience in the US has taught us the private sector is far more entrepreneurial and more effective at innovation. For example, the government has sought to subsidize and incentivize research and development in alternatives to fossil fuels. Recall the fiasco of Solyndra, a manufacturer of thin film solar cells that received massive subsidies from the government and then went bankrupt. One CLS scholar wrote that stressing property as the necessary incentive to productivity suppresses the need for resources to be widely available to others to make productive use of, as, for example, insisting on making all fruits of creative labor into intellectual property disregards how making knowledge into property limits the ability of other creative people to make use of a common stock of ideas for innovations of their own. So let's get rid of intellectual property rights. Perhaps this explains the heavy thumb on the scale for implementers, not innovators. And what about the neo-Brandesians? Obviously, they have stated their preference for massive regulatory frameworks, but we know from history what heavy-handed regulation does to innovation. The railroad industry and the airline industry give us very helpful examples there. And the desire to resuscitate the essential facilities doctrine necessarily is going to dampen incentives to innovate. Of course, contrast this with Schumpeter, who argues entrepreneurs are the source of dynamism. The United States has an amazing history of ingenuity and innovation, and I don't want to see the new neo-Brandesians shut that down. So, in conclusion, if you think the anti-monopoly movement is about monopolies, think again. Please read what Lena Khan and her colleagues and her bosses and her co-authors have written. They are telling you what they want to do with antitrust, with our economy, with our society. And then share what you've learned with others in the bar, on the Hill, in the press. As Hovenkamp said, if people understood what the neo-Brandesians were actually seeking, there would be an outcry. So let's all start educating people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. That was a real tour de force to explain the philosophy, because you're totally right, the neo-Brandesians revolution doesn't fall from the sky. It has the economic philosophy underpinning these different changes. And I think you explained that so eloquently. Thank you so much for your keynote address.